Located in the Gulf of Guinea off the west coast of Africa lies the island nation of São Tomé and Príncipe. São Tomé and Príncipe have the distinction of being one of the smallest countries in the world by both population and area, and as such, it's a country that many people have never heard of. But despite its small size, its geography and history makes it a country unlike any other in Africa. Learn more about the nation of São Tomé and Príncipe and how it came to be on this episode of Everything Everywhere Daily. This episode is sponsored by ButcherBox. One of my favorite things to make at home is surf and turf. That, of course, is some form of steak paired with some form of seafood. My go-to surf and turf meal will usually be a ribeye steak fried in an 80-year-old cast iron pan that was passed down from my father, coupled with some form of shrimp fried in butter. If you like surf or turf, ButcherBox is your hookup. They only carry 100% grass-fed, grass-finished beef, as well as wild-caught and sustainably harvested seafood. There are no additives or preservatives, and it's shipped freshly frozen to your door. When my ButcherBox shipment arrives, I feel like it's Christmas morning. If you like surf and turf, you are going to love their current special. Sign up today at butcherbox.com/daily and use code DAILY to get 2 100% grass-fed filet mignons and 2 wild-caught lobster tails for free in your first box, plus $20 off your first order. Save $60 on 2 of their highest quality cuts and save the legwork with their doorstep delivery. This exclusive offer only lasts until September 6th. Go to butcherbox.com/daily and use code DAILY to claim this deal today. This episode is sponsored by Noom. Noom is changing the game with weight management. You know how a lot of weight programs out there focus on what you eat? Well, Noom is using science to help you understand why you eat. And that makes all the difference in the world. Noom helps you understand the science behind your eating choices and why you have those cravings. And the best part is that you decide how Noom fits into your life, not the other way around. Noom takes a psychology-based approach that helps you maintain better habits and behaviors that are easier to maintain. So if you're one of those people who feel like food controls them, you're going to love Noom's psychology-based approach to weight management. Noom's personalized courses are easy to follow and will help grow your confidence with tools you can put into practice on day one. They'll give you the knowledge and wisdom that you need to make informed choices about what you eat. Based on a sample of over 4,000 Noom users, 98% say Noom helped change their habits and behaviors for good. Sign up for your trial today at Noom.com. That's Noom.com to sign up for your trial today. Before I get any further, for all of my Portuguese-speaking listeners, I should address the pronunciation of the name of this country. The proper pronunciation in Portuguese, which is the national language, is São Tomé e Príncipe. When I visited the country in 2014, we had an officer on the ship I was on who was from Brazil and insisted on using the correct Portuguese pronunciation for the country. The difference in pronunciation primarily comes from the diacritical marks, which are found in Portuguese and are not found in English. For the rest of this episode, I'm going to use the English pronunciation, which basically ignores the diacritical marks. So it will be São Tomé and Príncipe. That being said, the story of São Tomé and Príncipe begins with its geography. The islands of São Tomé and Príncipe are located in the eastern end of the Gulf of Guinea in what is known as the Bight of Biafra. This is basically the corner where the west coast of Africa goes from running north-south to running east-west. The islands are volcanic in origin and are part of the Cameroon Line. The Cameroon Line is a 1,600-kilometer or 1,000-mile chain of volcanoes that extends from the African mainland into the Gulf of Guinea. In addition to Mount Cameroon on the mainland and the 2 islands of São Tomé and Príncipe, the chain also includes the islands of Bioko and Annobon, which are part of the country of Equatorial Guinea. These islands are believed to be approximately 30 million years old. São Tomé, which is the larger of the 2 islands by both population and area, is 280 kilometers due west of the nation of Gabon and 428 kilometers due south of the nation of Nigeria. It's also located very close to the equator. The southernmost point of the island of São Tomé is 2 kilometers north of the equator. And it was sailing to São Tomé when I was inducted into the Order of Neptune, which is what you do when you cross the equator on a ship, and that is a whole other story. The island of Príncipe is located 142 kilometers northeast of São Tomé. And the island of São Tomé is approximately 6 times the size of Príncipe. The history of São Tomé and Príncipe is also very different from almost every other country in Africa. Africa, as you know, is the cradle of humanity. Humans and human ancestors have existed on the continent for almost 2 million years. However, there is no evidence that humans ever lived on the islands of São Tomé or Príncipe. This is in and of itself a really interesting thing. Bioko Island, which is the main island of Equatorial Guinea and part of the Cameroon line, was settled and did have native inhabitants. However, Bioko is only 32 kilometers from the coast and can easily be seen from the mainland. As far as we know, and there's been no evidence found to the contrary, the first humans to set foot on São Tomé were the Portuguese explorers João de Santarém and Pero Escobar. The dates which are celebrated for the first arrivals are December 21st, 1771 for São Tomé and July 17th, 1742 for Príncipe. December 21st is St. Thomas's Day, which is whom the island of São Tomé is named after. January 17th was St. Anthony's Day, and the island was originally named after St. Anthony but was renamed Príncipe, or the Prince's Island, after Alfonso, the hereditary Prince of Portugal, the son of King John II. The Portuguese found these uninhabited islands to be a great place to set up a settlement. In 1493, Álvaro Caminha received a grant from the Portuguese crown and established the first settlement on São Tomé. Getting people to come and live at the settlement was difficult. Many Jews in Portugal were sent to live there, including 2,000 Jewish children who were sent to work in the sugarcane fields. However, it wasn't long before São Tomé began the importation of slaves from Africa. The first slaves were brought to São Tomé to work in the fields. In 1510 alone, between 10 to 12,000 slaves were brought to the island of São Tomé. Slaves were not only imported to work on plantations in São Tomé, but São Tomé also served as a human transit hub for slaves from all over Africa. Slaves were brought from Angola, the Congo, and along the slave coast of what is today Ghana and Togo. From there, they were sent mainly to Brazil and the Caribbean. At one point, São Tomé accounted for a full 80% of the imports to Brazil, mostly from the human trafficking of slaves. As there were no indigenous people on the island, the number of slaves was overwhelmingly larger than the number of Portuguese. This eventually led to a major slave revolt on the island in 1595. The revolt was led by a man named Amador. For decades, slaves had escaped from plantations on São Tomé and settled in communities in the interior of the island. They were known as Maroons, and there had been slave and Maroon revolts on São Tomé for years. But throughout the 16th century, sugar had become less important as sugar production started to increase in Brazil. By 1595, with the sugar economy on the island in decline, there was infighting between the church, the government, and plantation owners. Amador used this instability to launch his revolt. It actually began small. On July 9, 1595, Amador and 2 of his lieutenants, Lázaro and Domingo, led a group into a church where they killed Portuguese men attending Mass. From there, the revolt spread rapidly. Within days, Amador had recruited over 5,000 slaves from the island to take part in his revolt. Amador had become the African Spartacus. He proclaimed himself king and organized his revolutionaries into an army. Amador and his army systematically set about destroying the Portuguese infrastructure of São Tomé. They ended up burning 60 of the 85 sugar mills on the island. The revolt, however, ended up being short-lived. After an attack on July 28th, Amador's soldiers took heavy casualties with over 200 killed. After the attack, the governor of the island offered clemency to anyone who surrendered, and over 4,000 took the offer. One of Amador's lieutenants betrayed him, and he and several other leaders of the revolt were captured by the Portuguese. On August 14th, Amador was executed, drawn, and quartered. Amador's slave revolt was one of the largest in the history of the Atlantic slave trade. After São Tomé and Príncipe became independent, Amador was declared a national hero. His face was on every note in the original currency issued by the country, the dobra, and January 4th is a national day in São Tomé and Príncipe in his honor. Amador's revolt accelerated what had been happening with the São Tomé economy. Sugar became less essential, and slaves became even more important, continuing its role as a transit point. While slavery remained the basis of the economy, through the 17th and 18th centuries, the number of Europeans on the island dwindled due to tropical diseases. Most of the free people on the islands were mixed race, and they began taking leadership positions. In the 19th century, agriculture made a return in the form of cacao and coffee. Both products were successful and grown on plantations, which were mostly owned by absentee Portuguese landlords. The slave trade dwindled through the 19th century as it was outlawed in more countries, and it was eventually outlawed by Portugal in 1876. However, it didn't necessarily stop the practice in São Tomé. For decades after the official emancipation of slaves on the island, the practice continued even though it was illegal. The forced labor conditions continued well into the 20th century. If it wasn't technically slavery, it was the closest thing to it. There was labor unrest and riots that took place throughout the 20th century, which culminated in the Batapa massacre on February 3, 1953. Members of the Portuguese International and State Defense Police, which was the security force under the Portuguese dictator Antonio Salazar, murdered approximately 2,000 Creole peasants on the island. This was an enormous percentage of the total population of São Tomé at the time. The post-war period saw a wave of decolonization and independence for countries throughout Africa. In the 1950s and 1960s, Britain, France, and other countries gave up their colonies, but Portugal stubbornly refused. The movement for the liberation of São Tomé and Príncipe was created, which was primarily run out of the neighboring country of Gabon. Salazar stepped down in 1968, but was replaced by Marcelo Caetano, who continued the dictatorial system known as the Estado Novo. However, on April 24, 1974, a coup took place in Portugal known as the Carnation Revolution. The new government instantly changed course on its policies towards its African colonies and announced that they would let them all become independent. This included São Tomé and Príncipe, which officially became an independent country on July 12, 1975. Since independence, São Tomé and Príncipe has had it better than most West African countries. Manuel Pinto da Costa, the leader of the São Tomé independence movement, became the first president of the country, a position which he held until 1991. After 1990, the country instituted a series of reforms that allowed for opposition parties. And in 1991, a free election took place where an exiled candidate, Miguel Trovoada, actually won. For the most part, save for a one-week military coup in 2003, the country has been mostly democratic, with open, transparent elections and peaceful transitions of power. The economy of São Tomé and Príncipe has had its ups and downs. After independence, all the plantations, which had been previously owned by absentee Portuguese landlords, were nationalized, which ended up resulting in the collapse of the coca industry. There was an eventual privatization of nationalized industries, and the coca industry rebounded, and today it's its largest export. One of the biggest potentials for the economy could be the oil and gas industry. There are oil and gas reserves offshore, but they have yet to be fully exploited. Another potential source of economic growth in the future is travel and tourism. I visited both the islands of São Tomé and Príncipe when I took a ship up the west coast of Africa. Both islands are largely unknown as a tourist destination, but both of them have enormous potential. São Tomé and Príncipe has also largely escaped many of the problems that other West African countries have faced after independence. There haven't been any civil wars, and the HIV/AIDS epidemic, which ravaged parts of Africa, has for the most part bypassed the islands. São Tomé and Príncipe is one of Africa's smallest and least populous nations. Despite dealing with de facto slavery for longer than almost anywhere else on Earth, this tiny island country has managed to become one of the more successful stories in Africa. Given its relatively stable democracy, natural beauty, rich volcanic soils, and still largely untapped oil and gas resources, São Tomé and Príncipe may have a very bright future. The executive producer of Everything Everywhere Daily is Charles Daniel. The associate producers are Thor Thompson and Peter Bennett. Today, I have a comment that was left over on Spotify, where, if you didn't know, you can leave reviews on individual episodes. Joseph Pontillo left a comment on my recent episode on multiple births. He wrote, "This is absolutely crazy. I've been listening for a very, very long time. Every night when I take my dog on a bike ride. My wife and I just found out today we're having triplets. Today. Wow." Well, thanks, Joseph, and congratulations. With triplets, you are really going to have your hands full. I've had many people reach out to me with strange coincidences when episodes are released, but yours is probably the greatest one yet. And if you're looking for names for triplets, if I may be so bold, I'll just throw this out there, perhaps you should consider the names Everything, Everywhere, and Daily. They might also work as middle names as well. Remember, if you leave a review or send me a boostagram, you too can have it read on the show.